Just a quick disclaimer before I get into this video. Some of the people I'm going to be talking about are veterans, and some of them have just done a lot to support veterans in my hometown. I want to point out my grandfather, Andre Parent, who has done so much to support veterans, even though he was not born in the United States and even though he never served in any military. He is, as far as I know, the only honorary member of our local American Legion post. I also want to point out Henry Merritt Jr. While his stories have been defined as outlandish even by the VFW, which he is a member of, the VFW has recognized the fact that he was a Force Recon Marine in the Vietnam era. Now, I don't know much about Force Recon, but I'm just going to go ahead and trust and assume that he was in fact in Force Recon, since that is the claim of the VFW. Now, these stories, some of them happened in person, and I feel like I can recount them perfectly accurately due to that, but some of those stories were told to me, and I just have to tell them to the best of my memory. So if you hear any inaccuracies that you know of, I want to apologize ahead of time. I'm not trying to be inaccurate, but like I said, I can only tell you what I've been told. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's get into the video and enjoy.
The other day I was talking to some people, talking about stories from back home in Maine. And, you know, when I was a kid, my grandmother and my grandfather were lifelong members of the American Legion in my hometown. And if you don't know what the American Legion is, I mean, you might have seen it around, or if you're not from the United States, obviously you won't know what it is. But basically, the American Legion is like a veterans organization, kind of like the VFW. And a lot of them just have like meetings, and they have like a building and a hall, like an event hall. They do fundraising activities and stuff to support veterans. But this particular American Legion in my hometown is a little rare compared to the average, because this one has a private bar that is open all the time. So even when there's not a meeting, there's people occupying the building. And because it's a private club, the bar could allow kids inside before like 7 o'clock at night. And in that process, I got to meet a lot of my grandparents' friends, and that always leads to some good stories. I was telling one of these, actually a couple of these stories last weekend, and you know, I never really thought much of them. You know, I almost, for probably a couple of years, I was a little embarrassed about it, but really it isn't about me, so I don't know why I was ever embarrassed to tell it. But they loved it. They thought it was the most hilarious thing they ever heard. I don't know if it's really that funny, but I thought I'd make a little video about it. So, for instance, in my hometown, I'm not going to say their name because many of them are still alive, and if they ever heard me say this, would probably take strong offense. But there's a family of people all with the same last name, and it seems like everybody in this family has some type of speech impediment. And there were a couple of them that went to this bar, this American Legion bar, and they both were hard to understand when they spoke. The wife, it was a husband and wife and a son, actually, all three of them were very hard to understand. And the wife was born with some type of speech impediment. The son learned his speech impediment from his mother, and the husband acquired his speech impediment because in 1987 he was at the good old McDonald's, eating a fish fillet sandwich, took his false teeth out, set them down onto the tray, and then when he was finished with his meal, he forgot to put his teeth back into his mouth, walked up to the trash can in the McDonald's, and dumped the whole tray into the trash, including his teeth. And it wasn't until he was well on his way home that he realized that he did not have his teeth in his head. He never went back to the McDonald's to retrieve his teeth, And ever since, up to the day of his death in probably, I'd say, maybe 2014, 2015, he did not have teeth. And so his speech was always impaired because of this. Another story is about a guy who is no longer with us, and actually he was one of the nicest guys to me as a kid. His name was Hippie Hank, and Hippie Hank was probably a solid 5'0", very short, very small guy, always wore a bandana with an American flag, always dressed up in like the full leather motorcycle type gear. Even though I do not know that he ever rode a motorcycle as I am right now, he always liked to dress that way. That was his preferred style. And like I said, he was very small. He had only 3 teeth that I could count, and none of them were in the front. He used to smoke a lot of pot, hence his name Hippie Hank. And yeah, he was just an old hippie, as everybody said. And you know, when I was a little kid, I mean, I'm like 4 or 5 years old. Because of the bandana, I always used to say he was a pirate. He looked like a pirate, and but also probably because of his lack of teeth. And you know, looking back on it, he kind of did look like a pirate rather than probably what he was trying to look like. But he also had, you know, some issues. I don't know, you know, if it had to do with the things that he experienced or his hard drug use. I know that he did more than just smoke pot. He did some harder drugs. But he had some mental issues, and one of them was that he was a complete compulsive and pathological liar, to the point where it was just comical, the things he would say. One example is, you know, he was sitting at the bar one night telling me a story when I was probably about, I don't know, 13, 14 years old. He was sitting there telling me a story about how he was fighting in Vietnam as some type of special forces unit. I don't know exactly which he claimed, if it was like scout, sniper, or recon or something. But he claimed that he was in a Marine Special Forces unit fighting in Vietnam when he got a letter from Dolly Parton saying that she desperately needed his help. So he stole a helicopter, flew the helicopter across the South Pacific, all the way across the country without being detected, landed in Tennessee, and saved her from the top of a roller coaster. Then, after saving Dolly Parton from the top of the roller coaster that she was trapped on, he knew that he had to get back to his post at Vietnam. So he was out of fuel in the helicopter, and he didn't know what he was going to do, just when 2 bald eagles flew up and each grabbed him by one shoulder and flapped him all the way back to Hanoi. He returned back to his duty post at Hanoi, and nobody in higher command was any the wiser that he was the guy that stole this helicopter. I didn't personally witness it, but a guy who was good friends with my grandfather, while in the bar at the American Legion, decided that it would be funny to slap my grandfather in the face while they were both drunk. Now, mind you, my grandfather is probably pushing, I'd say he had to have been pushing 70 at the time that this occurred, and this guy that was friends with him was probably in his mid-40s, lower 50s. Slaps him in the face in front of everybody, and the whole room just goes quiet. Everybody's staring at him. My grandfather has this look of disgust on his face looking at this guy. And this guy used to come over to his house and everything, was good friends with him, but crossed the line big time. My grandfather never spoke to that man again. He thought that was the most disrespectful thing anybody had ever done to him. And he wasn't even like in an argument with the guy, which is the funny part, or not so funny part, I guess. If we go back even further, just telling stories about my grandfather, some point back in the late 60s or early 70s, I don't know if this occurred at the American Legion bar or another bar in town, because back then there was a few more bars around. my grandfather is French. He's from Canada. He came here speaking French to harvest lumber. You know, he was basically cutting wood. And he's been in a few places throughout the state cutting wood. That was what he did when he came to the United States. Probably one of his first real paying jobs. Actually, might have been one of the few real paying jobs he ever had. You know, cutting wood. And a whole bunch of these Frenchmen had come down from Canada back then to do this. And so they all spoke French. They all kind of kept to themselves, did their thing. And he was at the bar with his brother, who also spoke French, and another guy from back home in Canada that spoke French. And they got into an argument about something. Who knows, being drunk. And my grandfather and him went outside, and the other Frenchman guy went over to his pickup and pulled out a .22 long rifle and shot my grandfather in the shoulder in the parking lot of the bar. And to this day, my grandfather from that point on became disabled, unfortunately, because he could not lift his arm up. Like, he could, like, my grandfather could not ride this motorcycle because he could not lift his arm up to this handlebar, his left arm, where he was shot in the shoulder. None of my grandfather, I think, has ever ridden a motorcycle, but yeah, so, you know, he was shot in the shoulder. The guy that shot him went on the run for like years and years, from the way I understand it. Obviously, I wasn't around at the time, but he was on the run for at least 10 years after shooting my grandfather in hiding, and finally got caught and only did like a couple of years in prison. Which, you know, it's pretty funny, you know, that he probably did worse to himself by running, you know, because he still did all the time he was going to do in prison, maybe even a little bit longer, and yet he was almost in prison in his own way, trying to hide that whole time. I mean, I don't know if it was quite 10 years, but I know it was a few years before they caught him. Another guy that my grandparents were friends with, that actually, you know, he was quite a character in my childhood. His name was Cody. He's gone now too. You know, that's what happens when people get old. But Cody, he was an interesting guy. He did quite a few different things. He drove a tank in the Army. I don't know what years he served in the Army. I would assume it would have had to have been pre-Vietnam, judging by his age, but it might have been during Vietnam. But he drove a tank. He was a tanker. I don't know exactly if he drove it or if he shot the gun or what. But that was what he did in the military. And then he came home. And he did a few different things. But pretty much the last job that he had was working at a sawmill. So like what he did was he cut boards. That's what a sawmill does, right? But back in these days, you know, I think sawmills are probably pretty automated now, but back in those days you had to push the lumber through the sawmill to make the boards, and he was pushing a board through this big circular saw. I wasn't paying attention, had his hand on top of the board, you know, and pushed it like right between his ring finger and his pinky, and sliced his pinky off with a saw in such a way it was like perfect. Like, you would not even know he was missing his pinky unless he pointed it out to you. Like, it was just like a perfectly straight cut. And then all of a sudden, like, you know, you might see something wasn't right, and you take a closer look, or he'd tell you about it and show it to you, and you realize you only had 3 regular fingers instead of the normal 4 and a thumb. And I always thought that was kind of interesting. And, you know... So he was a pretty cool guy. He knew the woods really well back in my area. You know, he knew the Katahdin Ironworks very well. He took us, like me and my grandfather and him went on a lot of fishing trips. You know, like when we go fishing, we don't go in a boat. We would walk. We would walk out onto these brooks and creeks and rivers and stuff, and fish off the banks, because a lot of these places, for the type of fish that they like to get, which is like brook trout and rainbow trout. It's not like typical to get them from a boat, and the creeks are just too shallow to really like be out in a big boat like you see on TV all the time. Like these are like where you gotta hike to your fishing spot. And I saw some of the most beautiful areas up in like the main Allagash areas and around Mount Katahdin and all that, going fishing with my grandfather and his friend Frank Cody. You know, it's an experience that really, like, I'll keep with me for the rest of my life. And I'm so happy that I had people like that in my life, even as funny and quirky and alcoholic as they were. You know, without those people, I don't know, you know, I don't know what I would be now. Funny story about going out fishing. There's another guy that was good friends with my grandfather. They call him Beagle, and I still like Beagle. I've seen him a few times in the last few years, but he's been keeping to himself lately. He's not as old. I'd say, you know, if he's 60 now, I'd be a little surprised. He might be 60, I'm not sure. But he's not as old as my grandfather, but he attended the American Legion with my grandfather. Anyway, they call him Beagle, and Beagle is just obviously a nickname, but he actually was quite a wealthy man. I mean, I don't know how much money he had, but he owned a logging operation, and he owned like some heavy equipment. I think he had a grader, a couple other pieces of heavy equipment. He had a lot of money. I mean, this is the type of guy that went out and he had like a brand new Ford Super Duty truck that he drove daily, and then he decided that, you know, he wanted to have like a camper, so he kept his daily driver Super Duty truck and then bought a dually Super Duty truck that he only drove to haul his camper. You know, he's like one of those guys, has like several different houses, all that. I mean, the man has to be, just from what I know about the things that he had and his lifestyle and the type of business he's in, I would not be surprised to find out that he was a millionaire a few times over. And he was very good friends with my grandfather, and he taught me a lot. He was going fishing with us. I think it was me, Beagle, my grandfather. I think my grandmother was with us too. She was actually very good at fishing, believe it or not. I think Frank Cody was with us. A couple other people were with us. And we were walking, and we got to this brook, but they called it the Big Rock. Ooh, that didn't sound good. My transmission made a funny noise, but it wasn't a big deal. So we went out to this area they call the Big Rock, and the hike is probably at least 2 miles, but not like 2 miles walking down a path, like 2 miles walking through like various wooded areas. And so we're walking out to the Big Rock, as they called it, and to get there you had to cross a little bit of water, and like you could step on other little rocks because the water wasn't very deep. And you know, I was walking through there, and then there was like a part where we had to walk, just wade through the water because the water was a little higher than normal. Oh shit, squirrel. So we walked through the water up to like maybe our knees or something, and I was walking along, and I stepped straight into a friggin' hole, and I just went down. Like I just went into the water, and you couldn't see the hole from up top, you know. And I mean, like, this hole had to be like 6 feet deep. Just went from being like up to your knees to being a 6-foot hole in the water. It was crazy. So I go down into this hole, and I'm like freaking out, trying to like not end up down in the hole. And I'm splashing around, trying to grab the edges of it. I pull myself out of the hole, and I'm splashing around in the water, still like freaking out because I didn't expect that. And Beagle's standing up there, and he says, "Kyle, stand up, the water's only up to your ankles." And I'll be damned, I had pulled myself out of that hole, and back into like the regular height water, and it sure enough was barely up to my ankles. And I'm just laying in a puddle like freaking out because I still thought I was like gonna be in the hole. But yeah, guys, well, pulling into the little shop here, so figure I'll just sign off now. Thank you guys for watching. Thank you guys for getting me to 1,000 subscribers as of last night. Dude, that's crazy. It seems like not that long ago I was all happy about hitting 100 subscribers. Now I hit 1,000 subscribers. So thank you so much for that, guys. And if you like these videos, you want to see more, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more. I'll catch everybody in the next one.